Yeah, but you laugh because you're a good guy.
No, filter, I understand the business, you know. Recording, filters. Look funny from the side.
Do you think?
And as Lennon continued to speak his truth, his list of targets only grew longer, including a few bands whose names would shock even his closest fans. Because for John Lennon, the battle for authenticity wasn't just musical, it was spiritual. As the 1970s unfolded, John Lennon was changing, not just as a musician, but as a man. He was living in New York, far away from England's rock royalty. The Beatles were gone, and for the first time, Lennon was completely free to speak his mind without the weight of a band's image holding him back. And he used that freedom to take aim at the new wave of rock bands he felt were destroying the soul of music. Lennon was never impressed by flash or fashion. While many artists of the 70s embraced glitter, makeup, and shock value, Lennon thought it was all a distraction. He once said, "If your music can't speak for itself, then your costume's doing the talking." His biggest target during this era? Led Zeppelin. While the rest of the world was hailing them as the gods of hard rock, Lennon wasn't buying the hype. In private interviews, he admitted that Robert Plant had an incredible voice, but he thought Zeppelin's music was too pompous. He felt they were obsessed with power and image rather than heart and meaning. "It's all thunder," Lennon joked, "but no lightning." To him, Zeppelin represented a dangerous shift, where ego was replacing emotion. He believed true rock and roll came from struggle and sincerity, not fame and excess. And in the 70s, he saw too many bands chasing the lifestyle instead of the message. Another group Lennon dismissed was Deep Purple. Their heavy riffs and dramatic performances didn't impress him. "It's just noise," he once muttered. While millions headbanged to Smoke on the Water, Lennon saw it as empty showmanship, sound without soul. But Lennon's criticism didn't stop with hard rock. He also had strong feelings about certain peace movement artists who, ironically, claimed to follow in his footsteps. One of them was Emerson, Lake and Palmer, ELP, the kings of progressive rock. With their grand concerts, orchestral sounds, and 20-minute songs, they were adored by critics. But to Lennon, they were everything wrong with modern music. "It's not rock," he said. "It's classical with electric guitars." He mocked their complexity, saying they were trying too hard to sound smart. What Lennon wanted and demanded was honesty. He believed music should move people, not impress them. "All these bands," he said once, "they forgot what it's about. It's not technique, it's truth." His honesty earned him enemies, but it also kept him real. Fans who loved Lennon knew he wasn't just another celebrity. He was a thinker who used music as a mirror to the world. Even when he went too far, people listened. His words carried weight because they came from a man who had lived through fame, failure, and rebirth. He knew what the industry could do to artists. He'd seen authenticity vanish behind contracts and headlines. That's why Lennon was so harsh. He wanted music to mean something again, to make people feel, not just dance. And while many disagreed with his opinions, one thing was certain: John Lennon had no fear of standing alone. Whether it was taking on governments, corporations, or the biggest rock bands on earth, he'd say what others wouldn't dare. But his criticism wasn't always about others. In his later years, Lennon turned that brutal honesty inward, questioning his own legacy, his mistakes, and the people he'd alienated along the way. Because the man who once preached peace had his own battles with darkness. And before long, his focus shifted from mocking others to understanding himself. By the late 1970s, John Lennon was no longer the fierce critic throwing verbal punches at the music world. He had changed, softened by age, fatherhood, and the simple desire for peace. After years of controversy, battles with the press, and his own personal demons, Lennon withdrew from the spotlight. For nearly 5 years, he disappeared into domestic life, focusing on being a husband and father rather than a rock star. But even in his quiet moments, Lennon remained opinionated. The fire that once burned with anger now glowed with wisdom. He still believed the music industry had lost its soul, but instead of attacking others, he began to question his own role in it. In one of his final interviews, Lennon admitted, "I used to think tearing people down made me honest. Now I think it just made me lonely. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man. Known for his brutal honesty, he confessed that many of the bands he'd criticized, from the Rolling Stones to the Beach Boys, had inspired him more than he'd ever admitted publicly. "We were all part of the same dream," he said. "We just played different parts of it." Even his old rival Paul McCartney found his way back into Lennon's heart. The two had exchanged letters and even discussed working together again before tragedy intervened. The bitterness that once defined their split had finally melted into understanding. But Lennon didn't completely lose his edge. When asked about the state of 1980s pop, he smirked and said, "It's disco with better haircuts." That wit, sarcastic yet observant, never left him. As he reflected on his younger years, Lennon realized that his hatred wasn't truly for bands or artists. It was for the machine that turned music into product. He had watched the industry chew up raw talent and spit out polished, empty fame. "They turn poets into posters," he said, "and call it art." Still, despite all his criticism, Lennon's love for music never died. He spent his final years writing songs again, not for charts or fame, but for himself. Tracks like Watching the Wheels and Beautiful Boy revealed a man finally at peace with who he was, and in those last months of 1980, he spoke kindly about artists he once mocked. He praised David Bowie for his creativity, Elton John for his sincerity, and even acknowledged that younger bands like Blondie and The Clash were doing what rock was meant to do, speak truth. It was as if the rebel had come full circle, from the angry young man tearing down others, to the wise elder celebrating authenticity wherever he found it. Then, on December 8, 1980, the music stopped. The world lost not just a Beatle, but a voice that had challenged generations to think, question, and never settle for lies. In the end, John Lennon's so-called hate list wasn't about hatred at all. It was about passion, a relentless demand for truth in a world full of imitation. He didn't hate those bands because they were bad. He hated what they represented. The loss of honesty in art, and maybe that's what made Lennon timeless. Even when he was wrong, he was real. He once said, "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to be heard," and decades later, he still is. Aging and helped shape the Beatles into the most influential band in history. But behind that message of peace, Lennon was brutally honest, often too honest. He didn't sugarcoat his opinions, and when it came to music, he wasn't afraid to say exactly what he thought. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Lennon's tongue was as sharp as his pen. He praised what he loved, Bob Dylan, Elvis, and Yoko's experimental sound. But he also had a notorious list of bands he absolutely couldn't stand. And when John Lennon disliked someone's music, he didn't whisper it in private. He blasted it in interviews, mocking their lyrics, sound, and even their success. His list wasn't about jealousy. It was about authenticity. Lennon hated what he saw as fake music, artists chasing fame instead of truth. From pop sensations that annoyed him to rock icons he thought were phonies, Lennon's opinions caused headlines, feuds, and a lot of hurt feelings. Some of the names on his hate list shocked the music world, not just because of who they were, but because Lennon had once admired them. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind Lennon's most controversial opinions, the 6 bands he openly despised, the reasons behind his brutal honesty, and how those rivalries shaped the rock scene forever. Because if there was one before he became a global icon of peace, John Lennon was a rebel, a working-class dreamer from Liverpool who used his wit, rage, and raw honesty to build the most famous band in history, the Beatles. But even in those early days, Lennon had little patience for pretense. He loved truth, even when it hurt, and he couldn't stand what he called plastic pop. In the early 1960s, the Beatles were the fresh-faced charmers of the British invasion, but Lennon, behind the scenes, was anything but polite. He was sharp-tongued, quick to judge, and brutally honest about the state of music. While others chased popularity, Lennon chased purpose. He once said, "I'd rather be hated for what I am than loved for what I'm not." That mindset shaped not only his career but also his views of other artists. Even at the height of Beatlemania, John was restless. He'd grown tired of the screaming crowds, the repetitive love songs, and the industry's obsession with image over substance. To him, too many bands were selling imitation rather than inspiration. One of the first groups to face his wrath was the Monkees, a band assembled for television, not born from friendship or shared struggle. Lennon once called them the fake Beatles, mocking their manufactured image. While he later admitted they had talent, he couldn't respect their origins. To him, authenticity mattered more than anything. That attitude began to define Lennon's worldview. He was passionate about real music, songs that said something. So when he heard bands that felt corporate or contrived, he dismissed them without hesitation. But it wasn't just newer pop acts that annoyed him. He also took aim at bands within his own circle. As the Beatles evolved from pop darlings to experimental innovators, Lennon's opinions grew even sharper. He felt certain artists were copying the Beatles' sound without understanding its spirit. He often voiced his frustration in interviews. "Everyone's trying to be clever," he once said, "but most of them are just pretending." As the 1960s came to an end and the peace movement took over, Lennon's musical tastes became even more personal. He admired raw, emotional artists like Bob Dylan and Chuck Berry, who sang from the gut, but he despised groups that, in his eyes, packaged rebellion into a product. His bluntness made him both admired and feared. While Paul McCartney preferred diplomacy, John never bit his tongue. Friends and reporters quickly learned, if you asked Lennon what he thought about another artist, you'd get the truth, whether you liked it or not. And as fame grew, so did his intolerance for hypocrisy. Even within his own band, Lennon's frustration boiled. He accused the Beatles' management and even Paul of chasing commercial appeal. "We sold out," he admitted once. "We got soft. That's not rock and roll." When the Beatles broke up in 1970, it wasn't just creative tension. It was Lennon's need to escape the noise. He wanted to be surrounded by truth, not marketing. And that's when his criticisms of other artists became even more public, even more savage. The world had known John Lennon the Beatle. But in the 1970s, the world met John Lennon the critic, unfiltered, unpredictable, and unafraid to name names. And some of those names? They were legends, bands the world adored but Lennon couldn't stand. And John Lennon never learned to do, it was stay quiet. By the early 1970s, John Lennon was no longer the mop-haired boy from Liverpool. He'd become something else entirely, a revolutionary with a guitar. His words cut deeper, his music grew more personal, and his opinions sharper than ever. As his solo career took off, Lennon's interviews became unpredictable. One day he was thoughtful and philosophical. The next, he was tearing down entire bands in a single sentence. For Lennon, honesty wasn't optional. It was his weapon of choice. The first band to face his infamous wrath was the Rolling Stones. While the world saw Lennon and Mick Jagger as friendly rivals, Lennon saw something different: imitation. He once said bluntly, "The Rolling Stones are doing what we did a year ago." He didn't hate them personally, but he couldn't ignore what he felt was creative mimicry. To Lennon, the Stones had built their empire by walking in the Beatles' shadow. He often pointed out how their album releases followed similar patterns, even their experimentation with psychedelia. Behind closed doors, he respected Jagger's swagger but felt the band lacked depth. Lennon believed that while the Beatles were breaking barriers, the Stones were simply chasing trends. In one interview, he even quipped, "Mick's a good mover, but he's no artist." Still, the tension wasn't pure hate. It was rivalry mixed with reluctant admiration. Deep down, Lennon knew they were part of the same story, two bands pushing each other toward greatness. But the second band on Lennon's hit list didn't receive the same grace. His anger toward the Beach Boys was far more complicated. In the mid-60s, the Beach Boys were America's golden boys, sunny harmonies, surfboards, and smiles. But when Brian Wilson released Pet Sounds in 1966, critics compared it to the Beatles' Revolver and Rubber Soul. Some even said it surpassed them. Lennon, who had poured his soul into the Beatles' sound, wasn't pleased. He felt Wilson's genius was genuine, but the California image was fake. "I like Brian," he once said, "but I don't buy the act." He hated the way the industry painted the Beach Boys as cleaner or more American than the Beatles, as if their wholesome image made them superior. To Lennon, music wasn't about smiles and sunshine. It was about truth, rebellion, and emotional honesty. That's why he often dismissed surf pop as music for commercials. Harsh words. But that was John. He couldn't pretend to like something that felt empty to him. Yet, ironically, Pet Sounds inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Lennon may have criticized the band, but he couldn't deny its influence. The difference, he believed, was authenticity. Lennon poured pain and chaos into his art. Wilson masked his behind harmonies. By this point, Lennon's bluntness had become legendary. Reporters began baiting him with questions about other artists just to hear him snap, and he rarely disappointed. But what made Lennon unique wasn't just his disdain, it was his reasoning. He didn't hate out of jealousy. He hated anything he thought was false. To him, the Rolling Stones were talented copycats. The Beach Boys were brilliant but too polished. Both, in his eyes, represented the industry's obsession with image over meaning.